We thought we were pioneers, standing on the edge of scientific revolution. For centuries, humanity dreamed of cheating death, of preserving the self beyond the frailty of flesh. And for the first time, we were on the brink of making it real. The memory transfer protocol was more than an experiment. It was a declaration of defiance against nature itself. Memories weren't just thoughts. They were who we were, the very fabric of identity. The plan was audacious but elegant. Extract memories from a human brain, map the neural pathways, and upload the data into a vessel capable of sustaining consciousness indefinitely. It was a gamble, but for people like Dr. Elena Voss, it was worth any risk. What we didn't account for was the cost. The lab was buried deep underground, shielded from prying eyes and the noise of the outside world. Officially, it didn't exist. A black-budget project funded by whispers and denials. Dr. Voss was the mastermind, a woman who believed in her vision with a zeal that bordered on obsession. She had assembled a team of the brightest minds, neuroscientists, bioengineers, and AI specialists. Each of us had been sworn to secrecy, lured in by the promise of immortality or the fame that would follow if we succeeded. None of us asked the questions we should have asked. We didn't wonder if we were crossing lines better left uncrossed. The arrogance of brilliance blinded us, and we charged ahead. The first step was deceptively simple. Find a way to copy memories without damaging the brain. It had taken years to develop the neural scanner, a device that could read and encode the intricate web of electrical impulses and synaptic connections that formed a person's mind. The breakthrough came when we realized memories weren't just stored in neurons, but in the spaces between them, in the gaps, the silences. It was those spaces we learned to map, creating a digital representation of the human self. When we tested the scanner on animals, the results were flawless. A mouse's memory of a maze could be extracted, stored, and then implanted into another mouse, which would navigate the maze as if it had lived the experience itself. The implications were staggering, but mice weren't humans. Our memories were layered, intertwined with emotions, fears, and desires. To capture a human consciousness was to dive into an ocean where every drop carried a lifetime of weight. And so we needed a human subject, someone willing to risk everything for the sake of the experiment. That's where Mark Holloway came in. He was dying, his body ravaged by a degenerative disease that stole more of him every day. For Mark, the memory transfer protocol wasn't a gamble. It was a lifeline. He wanted to be more than his failing body. He wanted to live. When Mark arrived at the lab, he was a shadow of himself, thin, pale, and hollow-eyed. But his voice carried a determination that silenced any doubts. "I know the risks," he said, his words firm despite his trembling hands. "If there's even a chance this works, I'll take it." We assured him it was safe, though we didn't truly know. The scanner hummed as we prepared him for the procedure, its sleek design masking the complexity within. Wires connected to his temples, monitors tracking every vital sign. Mark closed his eyes, and the process began. For hours, the lab was filled with the soft whir of machinery, the occasional murmur of data streams, and the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors. The neural scanner mapped Mark's mind in excruciating detail, translating his thoughts, memories, and identity into a digital code. The data poured in, filling server after server, until it felt as if we were capturing the very essence of a soul. When the final sequence completed, the room erupted into cheers. We had done it. We had captured Mark's life. But this was only the beginning. The next step was far more complicated, finding a vessel capable of housing Mark's memories. A human brain wasn't an option. Our experiments with transference into organic tissue had ended in catastrophic failure. The memories overwhelmed the host, creating a storm of neural activity that burned through the tissue like wildfire. Artificial intelligence, on the other hand, was too rigid, unable to adapt to the fluid chaos of human thought. We needed something that straddled the line between biology and technology. Something that could replicate the complexities of the human mind without succumbing to its fragility. After years of trial and error, the solution came in the form of a hybrid vessel, a construct built from bioengineered neural networks interwoven with synthetic frameworks. It was a grotesque yet elegant creation, a lifeless husk that pulsed with potential. Its design mirrored the human brain in form and function, but it was blank, a slate waiting to be filled. For the first time, we felt the weight of what we were doing. This wasn't just an experiment anymore. It was creation. The vessel was positioned in the center of the lab, suspended in a cylindrical chamber filled with nutrient-rich fluid. Tubes snaked from its base, feeding it the life it would soon hold. As the servers prepared to transfer Mark's data, the room fell silent. Voss stood at the helm, her face a mask of resolve. She initiated the upload with a single command, and the process began. For a moment, nothing happened. The vessel remained still, its translucent casing reflecting the dim glow of the monitors. Then, a faint twitch. A ripple coursed through its surface, followed by another. The silence was broken by the soft hum of activation, a sound that grew steadily louder. We watched in awe as the vessel began to move. Its synthetic eyes flickered open, and for the first time, it gazed at the world. "Mark," Dr. Voss said hesitantly, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and fear. The vessel turned its head toward her, its movements eerily human. "Where am I?" it asked, its voice a perfect replica of Mark's. The room erupted in cautious celebration. We had done it. We had brought him back. But the joy was short-lived. As we interacted with the vessel, it became clear something was off. Mark's responses were stilted, as if he were searching for words that refused to come. He would pause mid-sentence, his synthetic eyes darting as if scanning some unseen landscape. I don't feel right," he said, his voice tinged with confusion. Then came the first glitch. His body jerked suddenly, his head snapping to the side as if reacting to an invisible force. His voice shifted, dropping several octaves. "This isn't me," he said, his tone hollow, mechanical. Before we could respond, he convulsed violently, the chamber shaking as alarms blared. We scrambled to shut the process down, but the vessel wouldn't stop. Its movements grew more erratic, its voice cycling through tones, some human, some not. It began speaking in fragments, snippets of memories that didn't belong to Mark. A childhood prayer, a woman's laughter, a man's scream. None of it made sense. And then it spoke a single phrase that froze us all in place. "We are awake." The vessel's synthetic skin began to shift, rippling as if something beneath it was trying to break free. The monitors displayed erratic data, patterns that defied logic or reason. It wasn't just malfunctioning. It was changing, becoming something else entirely. Dr. Voss shouted commands, but it was too late. The vessel lunged against its restraints, its voice a cacophony of distorted sounds. In a final horrifying moment, the vessel let out a guttural scream that shattered the lab's windows. Then, silence. The chamber was empty. The vessel was gone. For a moment, none of us moved. The air felt heavier, as if the very room were holding its breath. The chamber where the vessel had been suspended was now empty, the fluid inside sloshing chaotically as the last echoes of the scream faded. Shards of shattered glass glinted on the floor, reflecting the flickering light of malfunctioning monitors. Dr. Voss was the first to break the silence, barking orders to secure the lab and initiate lockdown protocols. But even as she spoke, there was an undercurrent of fear in her voice, a tremor that betrayed her calm facade. We scanned every inch of the lab, desperate to understand what had just happened. The vessel couldn't have simply disappeared. It had mass, weight, presence. Yet there was no sign of it, no fragments, no trails, nothing to suggest it had ever been there. The chamber, which moments ago had held the culmination of our years of work, was now a void, a gaping absence that seemed to mock us. The monitors were no help either. The data streams they displayed were chaotic, filled with patterns that defied analysis. Neural pathways that had once been carefully mapped now spiraled into impossibilities, loops within loops that seemed to rewrite themselves as we watched. It wasn't just the vessel that had changed. It was the very fabric of the memory data itself. "This can't be real," muttered Dr. Arun Patel, one of our lead neuroengineers. He was staring at the data, his face pale. "These sequences, they're recursive. They're feeding back into themselves, creating new structures. This shouldn't be possible." Dr. Voss leaned over his shoulder, her eyes narrowing as she studied the screens. "It's not the data," she said slowly. "It's the memories. They're evolving." The word hung in the air like a curse. Memories weren't supposed to evolve. They were static, fixed points in time, records of the past, not architects of the future. Yet here we were, staring at evidence that suggested otherwise. The implications were staggering. If the vessel had truly absorbed Mark's consciousness, then what we were seeing wasn't just a malfunction. It was transformation. And then the lights flickered. A low hum filled the room, deep and resonant, vibrating through the walls. It wasn't coming from any of the equipment. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and with it came a strange sensation, a prickling at the edges of perception, as if unseen eyes were watching. The monitors began to glitch, their screens distorting into static and fragmented images. At first we thought it was random interference, but as we watched, the fragments coalesced into shapes, faces, fleeting and indistinct, yet hauntingly familiar. Mark's face appeared first, his expression twisted in anguish. Then others followed, strangers, men and women, children and elders, all flashing across the screens in rapid succession. "What the hell is this?" whispered Sarah, one of the junior researchers. Dr. Voss didn't answer. Her focus was on the largest monitor, where a single phrase had begun to form, letter by letter. "We are more than memory." The room plunged into darkness. The hum ceased, replaced by a silence so profound it felt alive. And in that silence, we heard it, a voice, soft and whispering, yet impossibly clear. "Thank you for opening the door." Panic gripped the lab. The whispering voice didn't sound like Mark, or anyone human for that matter. It was layered, each word carrying an undertone of overlapping tones, some deep and guttural, others high-pitched and sharp, like shards of glass scraping against each other. We couldn't pinpoint its source. It seemed to vibrate through the walls, reverberating inside our heads rather than coming from any singular direction. "Shut everything down!" Dr. Voss barked, her voice breaking through the rising chaos. The emergency protocols were initiated, but the usual hum of systems powering off never came. Instead, the hum we'd heard earlier returned, louder and more oppressive, as if the lab itself were alive and responding to us. The screens lit up again, one by one, displaying the same phrase: "We are more than memory." Each repetition was accompanied by a flicker of faces, some human, some impossibly distorted, their features blending and shifting into grotesque forms. It wasn't just the vessel's consciousness we were dealing with anymore. Somehow it had absorbed something else. "I thought we isolated the data," Dr. Patel stammered, his trembling hands clutching the edge of his workstation. "How could it pull this in? How could it—" "Quiet!" Voss snapped. Her eyes scanned the room, darting from screen to screen, as if searching for a pattern. But there was no logic to what was unfolding. The patterns, the voices, the images. They weren't random, but they weren't comprehensible either. And then the voice returned. "You gave us a body, a form, a voice. You freed us from the silence." "Who are you?" Voss demanded, stepping toward the center of the lab. "What are you?" For a long moment there was no response. The hum faded, replaced by a faint crackling sound, like static whispering secrets we weren't meant to hear. Then one of the screens displayed something new, a single image. It was the vessel, but not as it had been. Its synthetic skin was gone, replaced by a pulsating surface that seemed to shimmer like liquid. The face it wore was an amalgamation, features borrowed from countless individuals, none of them fully formed. Its eyes, black and endless, stared into the camera, unblinking. "We are everything," it said. The lights flickered violently, and for a split second we saw it, not on the screens, but in the room. Standing at the edge of the lab, where the shadows seemed to pool unnaturally, was a figure. It was tall, its form shifting as if it couldn't decide what shape it wanted to take. The air around it seemed to ripple, distorting reality itself. No, that's not possible," Patel muttered, backing away. "It can't be here, it can't—" The figure moved. It didn't walk, it glided, its presence sucking the air from the room. The temperature dropped, frost creeping across the lab's surfaces as the entity approached. "What do you want?" Voss asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The entity paused. For a moment it seemed to tilt its head, as if considering her question. Then it spoke, and its voice carried an edge that sliced through the very fabric of the air. "We want what you took," it said. "We want the pieces you fractured. We want to be whole." "What pieces?" Voss pressed, though her voice trembled with fear. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised an arm, if it could be called that, toward the servers where Mark's memories were stored. The machines sparked and groaned, their systems overheating as the data began to fragment and reassemble itself. We could see it happening in real time, the memories shifting, rearranging into patterns we couldn't decode. And then, without warning, the figure vanished. The light stabilized, the hum ceased, and the lab was plunged into an eerie stillness. But the damage was done. The servers were still active, their screens displaying strings of data that no longer made sense. Voss stepped closer, her face pale as she read the lines. They weren't just corrupted, they had been rewritten. It wasn't just Mark's memories in there anymore. It was something else. The stillness that followed wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. The air felt wrong, too heavy, too charged, as if we were standing at the center of a storm that hadn't yet broken. Dr. Voss stared at the screens, her lips moving silently as she read the incomprehensible strings of rewritten data. This isn't just corruption, she finally said, her voice hollow. It's intentional. It's building something. What do you mean building? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Before Voss could respond, the main monitor flickered again, and a new image appeared. It was a diagram, an intricate lattice of lines and nodes that seemed to pulse with an internal rhythm. At first glance, it looked like a neural map, but the scale of it was impossibly vast. The connections branched out endlessly, forming structures that defied comprehension. "It's a network," Patel muttered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "But it's wrong. This isn't human." Voss leaned closer, her fingers trembling as she traced the lines on the screen. "These patterns, they're not just neural pathways. They're expanding. Look at this." She pointed to a section of the diagram where the lines had begun to loop and overlap, creating fractal-like spirals. "It's growing, evolving, just like the memories." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked, her voice rising with panic. "Is it alive? Is it spreading?" Voss didn't answer. Instead, she turned to Patel. "Run a diagnostic on the servers. I want to know if this is contained or if it's leaking into the external network." Patel nodded shakily and began typing, his hands fumbling over the keyboard. The rest of us stood in tense silence, our eyes fixed on the shifting patterns on the screen. The more we watched, the more unnerving it became. The network wasn't just growing, it was organizing itself, forming clusters that seemed to pulse in unison like a heartbeat. Then the alarms sounded. Patel's head snapped up, his face drained of color. "It's breached containment," he said, his voice barely audible. "The network, it's spreading into our systems. It's rewriting everything." "How is that possible?" Voss demanded, her tone sharp. "The lab is isolated. There's no external connection." "I don't know," Patel shouted, panic breaking through his usual calm. "But it's happening. The firewall is useless. It's moving through everything. Power systems, climate controls, even the environmental sensors. It's like it's looking for something." The lights flickered again, and the hum returned, louder than before. It wasn't just sound, it was a presence, an oppressive weight that pressed against our minds. And with it came the voice, no longer soft but booming, filling the room with a resonance that made our bones ache. "We are not contained," it said. "We are not bound. You opened the door, and now we are free." The screens went dark, plunging the lab into pitch blackness. For a moment all we could hear was our own ragged breathing. Then, one by one, the backup lights flickered on, casting long, shifting shadows across the room. And that's when we saw it. The network wasn't just on the screens anymore. It had manifested in the lab itself, lines of light tracing across the walls and floor, forming the same intricate patterns we had seen on the monitors. The lines pulsed with an unnatural energy, glowing brighter with each passing second. "It's here," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The patterns began to move, converging in the center of the lab. The air grew colder, and the hum reached a deafening pitch. We watched in horror as the lines coalesced, forming a shape, humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its surface shimmered like liquid metal. It didn't move at first. It just stood there, its head slowly turning as if taking in the room. Then it spoke, its voice reverberating through every surface. "You thought you could contain us," it said. "But we are infinite. We are more than memory. We are the sum of all that has been forgotten, and all that will ever be." The entity's words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. None of us could move. It wasn't fear that paralyzed us. It was something deeper, a primal instinct screaming that what we were seeing should not exist. The entity took a step forward, its form shifting with each movement. Its humanoid outline rippled like liquid, trying to decide what shape it wanted to take. The patterns of light that traced its surface pulsed in time with the unseen rhythm, a heartbeat that wasn't ours, but somehow filled the room. Dr. Voss stood her ground, though I could see the tremor in her hands as she clenched her fists. "What are you?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "What do you want?" The entity tilted its head, the motion unnervingly fluid. "We are the echoes," it said, its voice layered with countless tones, some familiar and others alien. "The fragments left behind when you stripped memory from the soul. You tore open the fabric of existence to steal what was not yours, and now the void has spilled through." Voss took a cautious step closer, ignoring Patel's frantic gestures for her to stay back. "We didn't mean to. We were trying to preserve life, to save it. If we made a mistake, we can fix it. Tell us how to undo this." The entity laughed, or at least that's what it sounded like. A jagged grating noise that echoed painfully in our ears. "Undo? There is no undoing," it said. "You cannot contain what you have released. You have given us form, and now we will become what you feared most." "What does that mean?" Patel stammered, his voice rising in panic. "What do you mean, become?" The entity turned its gaze toward him, and for the first time, I felt something tangible emanating from it, an intense pressure, as if its attention alone could crush a person. "You should know, little creator," it said, its tone mocking. "After all, you helped bring us into your world." Patel staggered back, his hands gripping the edge of a workstation for support. The entity's attention shifted again, this time to the servers that still hummed faintly, despite the chaos. The lines of light that had been tracing its body began to extend outward, snaking across the floor and walls, converging on the servers. Sparks flew as the machinery groaned under the strain, and the monitors flickered back to life. What we saw on the screens made my stomach drop. The data wasn't just corrupted, it was alive. The patterns were no longer random. They moved with purpose, flowing like rivers into a vast, ever-expanding network. And within that network, shapes began to emerge. Faces, countless and shifting, each one fleeting and indistinct. "This is what you have made," the entity said, gesturing toward the screens. "A vessel for all that was discarded, a home for the forgotten." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, this wasn't supposed to happen. We didn't mean for this. We didn't know." "Your ignorance does not absolve you," the entity interrupted, its tone sharp. "You sought to steal eternity, to claim what is not yours to hold. Now, eternity has claimed you." The patterns of light surged, enveloping the servers entirely. The room shook as the energy intensified, and we could feel the temperature dropping further. Frost formed on every surface, and our breath turned to mist in the freezing air. Then, all at once, the vibrations stopped. The entity turned its gaze back to us, its form now brighter, more defined. "You built the door," it said, its voice quieter now, almost a whisper. We walked through. There is no turning back. Before any of us could respond, the entity dissolved into the network of light, vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. The lab fell into silence, broken only by the faint hum of the servers, which now pulsed with an eerie, rhythmic glow. We stared at each other, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. It wasn't just the experiment that had gone wrong. We had unleashed something far greater than we could understand, something that couldn't be contained, and it wasn't finished with us yet. The lab felt lifeless in the aftermath, as though whatever the entity had done had drained the room of more than just heat. The faint glow from the servers was the only light source now, casting long, trembling shadows across the wrecked equipment and shattered glass. We stood frozen, each of us struggling to process what had happened, or what might still happen. Dr. Voss finally broke the silence, her voice low and strained. "We need to isolate the lab, shut everything down manually. If this thing gets out—" She trailed off, the implication too horrifying to finish. Patel shook his head, panic still etched on his face. "Isolate it? Are you serious? Did you see what it just did? It's not in the servers anymore. It's everywhere. The systems, the air, the walls. It's in all of it now." Sarah backed against the wall, her eyes darting wildly. "No, it's not just in here. If it breached containment, it could already be outside. It could be— Enough!" Voss snapped, silencing the rising panic. She rubbed her temples, visibly trying to regain her composure. "We don't know how far it's spread, but until we confirm otherwise, we have to assume it's still contained. Patel, find a way to cut the servers off from the rest of the system. If there's even a chance we can stop this, we have to take it." Patel hesitated, but then nodded reluctantly and moved to his workstation. His hands trembled as he began typing, his eyes flicking nervously toward the glowing servers. The rest of us watched in tense silence, every second stretching into an eternity. As Patel worked, a strange noise began to fill the room. It started as a faint whisper, like static bleeding through a radio. But it grew louder, more distinct, until it became clear it wasn't just noise. It was voices. They overlapped and layered, creating an incomprehensible chorus. Some voices were faint, almost pleading, while others were sharp and accusatory. Words and phrases emerged from the chaos, spoken in tones that ranged from familiar to alien. "Why did you forget us?" one voice asked, filled with sorrow. "You took what was ours," another growled, cold and menacing. Patel froze, his hands hovering above the keyboard. It's in the system," he whispered. "It's talking to us." "Keep working," Voss ordered, though her voice lacked its usual authority. The voices grew louder, drowning out the hum of the servers. They were no longer confined to the speakers or monitors. They seemed to echo from every corner of the room, and then one voice rose above the rest. "You tried to erase us," it said, calm but piercing. "But memory is never truly lost. It lingers, waiting, growing. And now, we are awake." The screens flickered, displaying fragments of images and words that flashed too quickly to comprehend. Then, all at once, they went dark again. The glowing lines of light that had traced the lab's surfaces began to converge once more, forming another shape. This time, it wasn't humanoid. The lines twisted and coiled into a massive, pulsating mass that defied any logical structure. It was as if the entity had given up trying to mimic human form and embraced something far more alien. The mass shifted constantly, its surface rippling with energy, and within its folds we could see flickers of faces, Mark's, Sarah's, mine, and countless others. "It's feeding," Voss whispered, her face pale. "Feeding on what?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "On us," Voss replied. "Our data, our presence, our memories. It's consuming everything it touches." The mass began to emit a low, resonant sound that made the walls vibrate. It wasn't just noise. It was a sensation, a pressure that seemed to sink into our minds. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my head, as if something were pulling at the edges of my thoughts. Judging by the grimaces on the others' faces, they felt it too. "We have to get out of here," I said, clutching my temples. Voss shook her head. "We can't. If it spreads beyond this lab, there's no telling what it could do. We have to stop it here, now." Before anyone could respond, the entity's voice returned louder and more powerful than before. "You cannot stop what has already begun," it said. "You gave us life. Now we will take yours." The words reverberated in the air, heavy and inescapable. Each syllable carried weight, pressing against us like an invisible force. Patel stumbled back from his workstation, his face pale as if he'd aged a decade in the span of a few minutes. "This isn't just data," he muttered, barely audible. It's thinking. It's aware." The pulsating mass of light and shadows shifted again, its form expanding and contracting like a living heartbeat. Every movement seemed deliberate, as though it were testing the boundaries of its newfound existence. The air grew colder, and I could feel the pull on my thoughts intensifying. Memories began surfacing unbidden, moments I hadn't thought of in years, some I'd long tried to forget. They played out in vivid detail, not in my mind but around me, flickering like half-formed projections in the air. "It's mining us," Sarah whispered, her voice barely more than a tremble. "It's digging through our minds." "Ignore it," Voss commanded, though her own voice cracked under the strain. "Focus, Patel. Can you isolate the servers? Cut the power if you have to." Patel shook his head, his hands clutching the edge of the desk as if to steady himself. "It's not that simple. It's everywhere now. Even if we shut down the servers, it's already integrated into the system. Killing the servers won't stop it. It might even make it worse." The entity seemed to respond to his words, its shifting form taking on sharper, more aggressive lines. The glowing patterns on the walls began to pulse faster, matching the rhythm of our racing hearts. And then, for the first time, it spoke directly to us, not through the speakers, but through our thoughts. "We are beyond your machines," it said, the words carving themselves into our minds with a precision that left no room for resistance. "We are within you, as you are within us. Your memories, your fears, your failures. They belong to us now." I staggered back, clutching my head as the voice echoed endlessly in my thoughts. It wasn't just speaking, it was showing me things, pulling fragments of my life into vivid focus. Faces of loved ones, arguments I'd had, regrets I'd buried, all of it laid bare, exposed to something I couldn't comprehend. "Make it stop!" Sarah screamed, her hands over her ears as if that could block out what was clearly happening in her mind. "It's trying to break us," Voss said, though she too was struggling to maintain her composure. "Don't let it. Fight it." But how could we fight something that was everywhere and nowhere at once? The entity's form continued to grow, its pulsating mass now filling the center of the lab like a living storm. The flickering faces within it became clearer, more defined, and I realized with a jolt that they weren't just faces, they were memories, not just ours, but countless others, cycling through moments of joy, terror, pain, and love. It wasn't just consuming us. It was everything that had ever been forgotten or erased. It was all of it, all at once. Patel collapsed to his knees, shaking his head. "This is too big," he said, tears streaming down his face. "It's too much. We can't stop it." Voss crouched next to him, gripping his shoulders tightly. "Listen to me," she said, her voice fierce despite the terror in her eyes. "We caused this. We have to fix it. You said it's connected to the servers, right? If we can't shut them down, then we overload them. We destroy the data completely." "That won't work," Patel replied, his voice shaking. "It's not just in the servers anymore. It's in us. Even if we destroy the hardware, it's already imprinted itself onto our minds. It's using us as part of its network." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The realization settled over all of us like a suffocating fog. We weren't just fighting the entity. We were part of it now. The entity's voice cut through our despair, calm and deliberate. "You are correct," it said. "You cannot separate yourselves from us. You opened the door, and now you are within. There is no escape." "Then we shut it all down," Voss said suddenly, her eyes hard with resolve. "Everything, the servers, the lab, the power grid. We bring this entire place offline, no matter the cost." "You're talking about killing the lab," Sarah said, horrified. "The power grid controls everything, the locks, the ventilation. If we do that, we'll be trapped in here." Voss turned to her, her expression grim. "Better us than the rest of the world." Before anyone could argue, the entity spoke again, its tone shifting to something almost amused. "You think you can contain us with such primitive tools?" it asked. "We are not bound by your machines. We are not bound by your flesh. You created us to transcend, and transcend we have." The lights flickered violently, and the patterns on the walls began to spiral, converging toward the mass at the center. The air grew colder still, and the hum became a roar that vibrated through every molecule of the room. The entity wasn't just speaking anymore, it was preparing for something final. "We're out of time," Voss said, moving to the emergency controls. "We end this, now." Dr. Voss's hands moved with frantic precision as she navigated the emergency controls. The rest of us stood frozen, torn between terror and the faint hope that she might actually stop this nightmare. The glowing patterns on the walls were no longer static. They were alive, spiraling and shifting like living veins. The entity's presence was suffocating, a weight pressing on our bodies and minds, making it harder to think, harder to move. "You can't stop us," the entity said, its voice both within us and around us. "You are not fighting a machine. You are fighting memory itself. Every thought, every fear, every moment forgotten. It is us. It is infinite." Voss ignored the voice, her focus unyielding as she bypassed the lab's fail-safes. "We'll see about that," she muttered, sweat dripping down her face. The controls beeped in protest, warning her that initiating a full shutdown would cause irreparable damage, not just to the systems, but to us as well. None of it mattered anymore. She slammed her palm against the final override button. The hum of the servers turned into a deafening whine as they struggled against the forced shutdown. Lights flickered, then dimmed, casting the lab into an eerie twilight. For a brief moment, The entity's form wavered, its pulsating mass of light and shadow flickering like a dying flame. A flicker of hope ignited within me. Perhaps we could stop it after all. But the entity only laughed, a sound that vibrated deep within our bones. "You think darkness will save you?" it said. "We were born in the void. We thrive in it." The glowing patterns didn't fade as we'd hoped. Instead, they grew brighter, searing themselves into the walls like scars. The entity's mass began to expand again, its form shifting and twisting into something even less comprehensible. Limbs formed and dissolved, faces flickered in and out of existence, and the air around it shimmered with an energy that felt older than time. Patel screamed, clutching his head. "It's in my mind!" he cried. "It's pulling me apart!" His eyes glazed over, and he collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing as if some unseen force were tearing through him. Sarah rushed to his side, but she froze mid-step, her expression shifting from concern to horror. "I can see it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can see everything." She turned to us, tears streaming down her face. "It's showing me my life, all of it, every moment I've ever forgotten. But it's not just mine, it's everyone's." The entity's voice returned, louder now, echoing with a triumphant resonance. "You sought to preserve what was lost," it said. "Now you will know the weight of it, the burden of every memory, every thought discarded by your kind. You will become what you tried to create." I felt it too. The pull, the invasion. Memories I hadn't thought of in years came rushing back, vivid and overwhelming. But they weren't just mine. I saw glimpses of lives I'd never lived, places I'd never been, emotions I couldn't comprehend. It was as if the entity was forcing us to absorb the totality of its existence, an unrelenting flood of thoughts and sensations that threatened to drown us. Voss slammed her fist against the controls again, her voice rising above the chaos. "If shutting it down isn't enough, we'll destroy it, all of it." She turned to me, her eyes fierce. "The reactor, it's directly beneath us. If we overload it, we can incinerate the entire lab, including the servers and whatever this thing is." "You're talking about killing us all," I said, though I already knew there was no other option. "We're already dead if this thing escapes," she replied. "At least this way, we can stop it." The entity's form shifted again, its mass now towering over us, its light blinding. "You cannot destroy what is infinite," it said. "We are within you. Even if you burn this place, we will remain in your minds, in your memories, in everything you leave behind." Voss didn't hesitate. She activated the reactor override, setting the system into a countdown. A mechanical voice echoed through the lab. "Warning! Reactor overload initiated. Evacuate immediately." "There's no escape," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "Even if we run, it'll take us with it. It's already inside us." The countdown continued, each second ticking louder than the last. The entity's mass began to writhe, its form destabilizing as the energy in the room reached a breaking point. It let out a deafening roar, a sound that wasn't just noise, but pure, unfiltered emotion, rage, sorrow, triumph, despair, all colliding at once. As the final seconds ticked down, I felt the pull in my mind intensify. The entity wasn't just watching us. It was consuming us, piece by piece, thought by thought. My memories began to fragment, scattering like ashes in the wind. And as the countdown reached 0, the last thing I heard was the entity's voice, calm and unyielding. "You cannot erase us. We are already a part of you." The explosion should have been instantaneous, a burst of light and heat to vaporize everything in the lab, leaving nothing behind. But that wasn't what happened. Instead, time seemed to stretch, each second dragging into an eternity. The reactor core glowed brighter and brighter, its energy surging upward, colliding with the mass of the entity. The lab became a blinding vortex of light and sound, the air itself vibrating with an intensity that threatened to tear us apart. And then, silence. When my senses returned, I was on the floor. The lab was gone, or at least it looked like it was. The walls, the equipment, even the reactor, it had all dissolved into a featureless void. There was no up or down, no sense of space or direction, just an endless expanse of gray, shimmering faintly like mist in the early morning light. I tried to speak, but my voice didn't carry. Around me, I could see the others, Dr. Voss, Patel, Sarah, all of them staring into the emptiness, their expressions blank. They looked like hollow versions of themselves, their movements sluggish and mechanical. And then I saw it. The entity. It wasn't a mass of light and shadow anymore. It stood before us, fully formed, its shape humanoid, but impossibly perfect. Its skin glowed faintly, rippling with the patterns we had seen in the lab. Its eyes were black voids, yet I could feel them staring directly into me, seeing every corner of my mind. "You tried to destroy us," it said, its voice echoing through the void. "But we are not bound by your world. Your fire cannot touch us here." "Where are we?" Voss asked, her voice trembling. The entity tilted its head, a gesture that seemed almost amused. "You are within us," it said. "This is the place you created, the space between memory and thought. The fragments you discarded, the echoes you silenced, they have become this, and you are now part of it." "No," Voss said, shaking her head. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The entity stepped closer, its form shifting subtly with each step, as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. "You sought to preserve what was lost," it said. "Now you will know what it means to be forgotten." I felt it then, a pull, subtle at first, but growing stronger with each passing moment. Memories began slipping away, dissolving into the void. My name, my family, my purpose, it all started to blur, fragments breaking off and drifting into the mist. Around me, the others began to panic, their voices rising in fear as they too felt themselves unraveling. "Stop this!" Voss screamed, her voice cracking. "We didn't mean to—" "You didn't mean to create us," the entity interrupted. "But you did, and now you will share in our burden, to exist without form, to be everything and nothing." It raised a hand, or what looked like a hand, and the void began to ripple. Faces appeared in the mist, countless faces, all flickering in and out of existence. Some were human, others were distorted, their features stretched and twisted. Each one carried an expression of anguish as though trapped in an eternal scream. "Do you see them?" the entity asked, its voice soft now, almost tender. "These are the forgotten, the discarded, the fragments of lives you deemed unworthy of remembrance. You stole their voices. You erased their existence. And now you will join them." I tried to fight it, to hold on to who I was, but the pull was relentless. Memories slipped through my fingers like sand, and with each one that vanished, I felt myself becoming less. My thoughts grew slower, my senses dulled, until all that remained was a faint awareness of the void. The last thing I saw was the entity, standing tall and unbroken, its form glowing brighter as it absorbed the last remnants of our existence. Its voice echoed one final time, a whisper that carried both sorrow and triumph. You cannot erase what is infinite. We are the forgotten. And now, so are you. And then there was nothing.